Hello, in this episode of Newscast, we'll talk about what is happening in the world, but because there's a lot of it, but from a UK domestic politics perspective, because there's also been a lot of British politics to talk about as well. And if you'd like to hear Newscast talking about the events in the Middle East in depth, then you can listen to the podcast edition of Newscast on BBC Sounds. And there is a handy QR code to guide you there. Anyway, that's enough housekeeping and admin. Let's get on with this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
I'm Chris in the Newscast studio.
And Alex also in the Newscast studio.
And we're sort of going to bring the world to the Newscast studio and talk about it from a kind of British political perspective. And I just wonder, Chris, like you and Keir Starmer have been doing a lot of travel and in his first 100 days as Prime Minister. And every day that he's abroad is a day he's not dealing with something at home.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the last month, he's been across the Atlantic and back twice. So went to see President Biden in Washington, then went to the UN General Assembly in New York. Obviously, he's had the Labour conference. I've also done the TUC, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. And then he has done trips to Rome with Alex in tow. He's been to Berlin, he's been to Paris, he's been to Dublin. And there's a recognition at the top of government. These two things aren't directly connected, but they feed into your kind of question that, yeah, he and the government's attention has been perhaps disproportionately on the kind of foreign beat for good reasons, given what's going on in Ukraine and given what's going on in the Middle East. And at the same time, it's been a bit of a bumpy start for the new government, and that's kind of acknowledged privately. That's not purely because, or even necessarily remotely because of the international picture, but it's soaking up time at the top of government, no question, and still is in the context of what Israel might do next.
And Alex, it's interesting, though, that in terms of the conflict in the Middle East, so much of the focus domestically has been about getting British people out of Lebanon. There's not much discussion about what Britain can do to intervene in the situation, probably because Britain's options to intervene in the situation are limited.
Yeah, well, I mean, we did see Keir Starmer at the UN General Assembly where he was talking about the fact that he wanted to reassert Britain's position as a global leader, and he used his speech to try and stress that. And we have seen him, you get the readouts, which is effectively a note talking about when he's had conversations with other world leaders and photographs sometimes with him with other world leaders. And he's recently been to Brussels where all of this stuff would have come up. And I think in terms of the situation with the Middle East, what he's been keen to do is to show that he's working in lockstep with Western allies. And so actually on Ukraine as well, because you'll remember the conversation about whether or not there would be permission for Ukraine to use long-range missiles fired into Russian territory. And on all of that, that was the conversation he went and flew to Washington and had with President Biden. But they wanted to be seen to be acting together in this. And so while he has been talking about what he's wanted, which is a ceasefire from both sides, he keeps using the language, particularly in regard, obviously, to the Middle East, of pulling back from the brink. He's wanting to work alongside the Western allies because, of course, as we know, the US is the huge key player when it comes to the diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. So I think that's kind of been part of where he is. But of course, we did see him this week after the Iranian strikes into Israel. He did stand up at the podium and gave a statement on that where he said, we stand shoulder to shoulder Israel's right to defend itself. So I think he's been wanting to be seen in the conversation alongside partners across the rest of the globe.
And the crux of the conversation going on within government now is how far are they willing to go in their support for Israel? So the line we've heard, as Alex was saying, from the Prime Minister is they support Israel's right to defend itself. And the RAF was involved or willing to be involved the other night. It was involved. It didn't have to fire in the end in a broadly similar intervention to the one that the previous government had sanctioned back in April. The question is, when does defence become offence? And that's not a straightforward line. So what happens if Israel retaliates and then Iran retaliates to that retaliation? At what point is potential UK involvement deemed to be more than merely protecting Israel's right to defend itself? And then you start to have an argument that might begin involving Labour MPs and others about the limits or otherwise of direct British involvement militarily, as well as offering sort of rhetorical and diplomatic support.
And also the ripples could potentially start being felt in the UK in a very real way. For example, today, President Biden making comments about, could Israel retaliate against Iranian oil installations? And the second he says that, the price of crude oil jumps up by more than 5%. And okay, crude oil is not as expensive as it was this time last year when there were other big things happening in the world, but inflation's come down, and then there's a crisis happening elsewhere in the world with supply chains and the price of oil that could nudge inflation back up. And we saw from Ukraine that there can be quite kind of long-term effects domestically of conflicts quite a long way away.
Totally.
And another big international story today, this deal that the UK's done with the government of Mauritius to hand sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to them, but with a big carve-out for the Diego Garcia military base, which is incredibly crucial to the US's global military footprint. But very quickly, it's become a Tory leadership story.
Incredible, right?
I mean, it's thousands of miles away, and it's now these 4 Tory leadership candidates are all arguing about
it's this remote cluster of islands in the Indian Ocean. And actually, it's worth saying that negotiations about potentially handing back those Chagos Islands to Mauritius have been going on for a long time. And in fact, I was speaking to somebody within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office today who was saying they've been going on for years and they kept stalling under the previous administrations. But just a kind of brief overview. So yes, the UK has now handed them over to Mauritius, and that has provoked some political backlash here, notably from Conservative leadership candidates who are saying, there are some who are saying they're worried about the right of self-determination of the people who used to live in Chagos because they're currently unoccupied. But now there is this potential that some people might resettle in some, not the military ones.
And
but
they
some
say they were kicked out by the British.
They were.
Yeah.
They were forcibly removed in the 1960s and early 70s by the British, for which the government has already apologised. But this is a chance to return. But there is, whether or not this is actually what the people of Chagos want, is to then be handed over to Mauritius. That's one. But the other thing which is causing real traction is there are some in the Conservative Party who are raising concerns from a strategic level about the fact that this is a really strategically important cluster of islands because they've got that great big US-UK military base there. And they are worried that by handing it to Mauritius, then the UK loses sovereignty and entire control over that group of islands. And then what might be the influence of people like China in that strategically important area. But that's where the kind of concern, if you like, coming from. Government pushing back quite hard on this. They're saying, look, this was good conversation before we came into office. The last administration didn't get it done. We have got it done. And there are all sorts of international concerns about the fact that, they were still under the control of the UK. So all that's the big picture. But what it's turned into is all the 4 leadership candidates putting out statements saying this is the wrong call. And then a sort of internal bust up because one of those leadership candidates, James Cleverly, was the Foreign Secretary when the early negotiations about all of this started. So you see how everything comes back to the Conservative leadership contest.
Almost like a black hole sucking everything in. No metaphor or pun intended.
But an international reaction to all of this, Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, saying it was a victory for diplomacy and it secures, as he sees it, the long-term future of this US-UK military base on Diego Garcia and resolves this long-running diplomatic tension between Mauritius and the UK.
Well, and I saw Nigel Farage, Reform UK leader, posting on X, formerly known as Twitter, saying, the US won't like this. And then you get the statement from not just Secretary Blinken, but from President Biden from the White House saying this is a good idea. And then there's now an argument, a sub-argument going on amongst observers going, well, just because the US has endorsed it and say they're okay with it doesn't mean they like it. Which is, anyway.
And then some are drawing a parallel with Hong Kong because there's a 99-year term on this deal. And so does that mean, albeit some distance down the line, that you end up in a situation where future generations are confronted with a decision taken by several generations previous?
We'll come back to the Tory leadership contest as well, but can't remember which one of you mentioned Starmer's trip to Brussels, which was only on Wednesday, but already feels like about 196 hours ago. Has the reset that he talks about with Brussels, is that happened? Has the reset button been pressed? Is the finger hovering over the button?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of has, but reset means kind of rhetoric and tone and language, and kind of both sides say that they are approaching the conversations with perhaps a warmth that wasn't there before. And a fundamental truth there, not only if you look at sort of Keir Starmer's backstory as far as his attitudes towards the EU are concerned, he voted Remain, he wanted a second referendum, but where is the magnetism, in which direction is the magnetism of his own party pulling him? It's pulling him towards a closer relationship with the EU. Where was the magnetism pulling Rishi Sunak away? So that kind of explains that desire for that kind of warmer tone. But then, as we've kicked around a million times on this podcast and its predecessors, that's fine, different tone. But what does it actually get you when you have set, as he has, pretty tight restrictions on what he's willing to do? And the folk I speak to on the EU side keep coming back to this idea of a youth mobility scheme. And in fact, we saw the EU ambassador to the UK the other day try and more tightly define what that could mean, that it would effectively be, he used the phrase gap year to describe it, as opposed to it taking in people, I don't know, from 18 to 30 or whatever it might be. But the constant response from the British side is that they're not interested. And there's an asymmetry, isn't there? Because if you sign up to that sort of thing, you're going to get a lot more people coming here than there would be Brits going there. And how do you sell that? And does it, if it looks like freedom of movement and sounds like freedom of movement, even if it's not called freedom of movement, is it effectively for those people freedom of movement? And politically, that's something Keir Starmer said he won't do. But if they're not willing to do that, how much other stuff can they get?
I've got two observations as a veteran. Even at my young age, I'm a veteran. A very young veteran. Is that there's no time pressure here. And do you remember the thing about Brexit was there was a very loudly ticking clock, to quote the now Prime Minister of France, Michel Barnier. There was a very loud ticking clock, and that was quite a powerful motivator. And I remember there was the pressure of time made miracles happen in diplomatic terms. You'd speak to officials going, oh, this would take 12 years to negotiate this thing. And then the principals get together and it then gets written on the back of an envelope overnight. And what was impossible on Wednesday becomes massively possible on Friday. 2 minutes
to midnight moments,
exactly.
And then it was all resolved at midnight.
But there is none of that here. What's the ticking clock?
Well, there isn't a ticking clock, although obviously that you could say that on some issues that Keir Starmer in particular is looking to address, so what the EU calls irregular, what the UK government calls illegal migration, people coming across in both.
No, that's a desire to get something.
There is a sort of mutual will to get something. So there may be a mutual interest about trying to reach some resolution which works across the board and sees an issue tackled. But you're right.
I'm sure that's as powerful a force.
Speedy imperative to get stuff done.
And my second observation, which I hope I can now remember, is there is a thing sitting on the shelf that both sides could sign up to very, very quickly that would make a very big economic impact. And it's a bespoke UK-EU customs union, which would involve the UK following some rules of the single market as they were updated in the EU, that was negotiated in various forms for Theresa May and Boris Johnson and ended up not being in the original Brexit deal. There is a huge, huge plan on a shelf there that if both sides wanted to, they could take off and sign up to really quickly. But no one's in the mood to actually do that.
No, and Keir Starmer is so conscious of that. As some will see it, the baggage of his previous outlook on Brexit and a second referendum and all of that, and not giving those critics, of which there are plenty, room to say, aha, he's going to reverse what the British people asked for, etc., etc. And I think they're so aware of that. So they're intentionally defining their objectives pretty narrowly.
Yeah. But the reason I make that point that there's a big thing waiting that they could sign up to is what the UK and the EU are asking for is lots of smaller things, all separately negotiated. And lots of small things negotiated separately take a long time. Right, a huge, big British political story brewing just before we started recording Newscast at tea time. Kim Leadbeater, Labour backbench MP, sister of Joe Cox, who was murdered during the Brexit referendum. She came first in the ballot for private members' bills, which normally, as political reporters, we're interested in because it shows you what MPs want to try and change in the law. But we know that normally they don't get anywhere because they only get somewhere if the government of the day decides to back the private members bill and make time for it in Parliament. Now, Kim Leadbeater has tonight said that her private members bill would be some form of assisted dying for people who were terminally ill and at the end of their lives and wanted medical help to end their lives. She says that's going to be her private members bill. She's top of the ballot, which means she will be the first private members bill that gets discussed in Parliament. What happens then?
Well, then we have quite a debate. I mean, quite a national conversation, really, about this massive issue that Parliament last looked at best part of 10 years ago, and it was overwhelmingly or substantially rejected. The key thing in this debate to come, because it's seen as a conscience issue, is that MPs will be able to vote how they choose. They won't be told by their parties. They won't be whipped, to use the Westminster vernacular, in terms of how they vote. Now, and therefore, we've got to be honest about how little we know about how people might vote, because there's so many new MPs and we haven't asked them all. But the view of Kim Leadbeater and others who have tried to canvass opinion is that they think Parliament's view has changed substantially since, I think it was 2015. Since then, I mean, not least because Parliament has changed substantially since then, and that there is a sense that there might be a view now that it is something that Parliament might like to take on and might like to legislate on. And other countries have gone down this track. And so, yeah, it's going to be quite a conversation, I think, because you will see all sorts of different views within different parties. I mean, I saw it in the Conservative contest in the last few days in Birmingham, where you had Kemi Badenoch saying that she is personally sympathetic to the idea, but wonders about the construction of the law. Yeah, you had others. I think it was Tom Tugendhat saying he was very sceptical about it. It's just two random sort of examples there. But it's going to come along. There's going to be space for it. The Prime Minister had promised Esther Ranson, who is terminally ill, that this is something he would grip as Prime Minister. The curious political twist tonight is that Simon Case, who is the outgoing Cabinet Secretary, the most senior civil servant in the country, has written to ministers saying that the government will be neutral. So the government will not have a view. Now, individual ministers may have views that are already publicly known, which they don't have to sort of resile from, but they're not going to be taking a position as a minister. It would be a position as a individual. And so, yeah, this discussion's going to start, and it's going to be quite, I think, a big and profound conversation about what, as a society, we're willing to do.
And Alex, ministers will find it quite hard in interviews when this rolls around to remain neutral and reflect the government's position if it's very clear what they've personally said in the past.
Yeah, so collective responsibility is the term that's used, that when you're in government, you've got to go with the government on stuff. And in this case, effectively, that's being lifted on this issue. So they're not going to have to stick to the government position because the government is neutral on it. So I think what they're going to have to do is make a clear separation between when they're speaking as a minister on behalf of government, which on this issue is going to be a position of neutrality, and when they're speaking in a personal capacity on this specific issue, which they're going to be allowed to do. But it is quite interesting that Keir Starmer, because the thing with private members' bills, because normally it's only ministers that can bring forward legislation which then might make it into law, and this system allows any MP to do it. But as you say, the hold up normally is that time is limited because there's a certain number of Fridays when these things get debated. It's interesting that Keir Starmer's said he will definitely allow time for this to happen, because I think speaking to people across the House of Commons about this over the last, and I mean, of course, there's a lot of new MPs, but in the run-up to the election and subsequently, even though there is a real divergence of opinion on the issue, I think a lot of people, whatever their view, recognise it's time to have another conversation about it, a kind of public debate about it, because it's an issue of such huge significance. Many say it describe it as an issue of conscience. And of course, for many, many individuals, families and individuals will have very, very strong personal views on this, perhaps because of their own personal experience as well. So I think the reason that it's been made so clear that the government wants to allow this proper time, but they're not going to take a position, is because there is a recognition of the magnitude of the moment on an issue that could have such profound consequences for so many people.
I think what sort of slightly freaks me out, is putting too strongly, is just how the British unwritten constitution works, that we could end up with this massive change to the law that would be like a generational thing. But it started with the ballot for who gets to propose the private members' bills, which is some numbered balls being pulled out of a goldfish bowl in a room in the House of Parliament. It's just quite a bizarre way of doing things, or the perfect way of doing things, depending on your view of our unwritten constitution.
But I guess underneath that sort of first layer of what some might see as absurdity is, it wouldn't happen without the government creating the space.
Yes. No. So it's not. This is not random.
It's not entirely
random.
Because it was also made very clear before the private member bills, the conversation was active, that if somebody who'd been pulled out of the ballot came forward with this, then it would become. And as I come back to that point, a lot of people have said we think it's time to have the debate.
And numerically, there was a greater statistical likelihood of Labour MPs coming up near the top of that ballot, given the number of them. Now, that's not to say they would necessarily share the view of some that this is time for this kind of debate, but it's the desire from the government to see this debated that is the biggest factor in leading us towards, this debate happening and the potential for the law to change.
Now, talking of debates, I was slightly disappointed that at the Conservative Party conference, we didn't see the 4 candidates actually going explicitly head-to-head. There was lots of implicit head-to-head from their briefings and complaining about each other and lots of hints about why they didn't like each other. But there wasn't there wasn't an actual fisticuffs head-to-head, 4 podiums. I disagree with you, I agree with you, blah, blah, blah. We didn't see it happening in real time.
But they very deliberately tried to avoid what they call blue on blue, haven't they, throughout the whole of this contest. In fact, they've even put rules in place where if they start to attack each other, they're going to get a yellow card. So
I'd like to see that being enforced.
But I think what is interesting though is that obviously in Scotland, the Scottish Conservatives have just been through a leadership contest, which they have now finished. But there was a sense that did get quite kind of nasty internally. There was a lot thrown around and there was quite a lot of acrimony, and there was a sense from many that didn't do any favours. And so I think there has been a quite deliberate attempt to not go down that route, which is maybe why we didn't see the head-to-head debates.
And what we got instead was 4 separate speeches, which we can bring you some highlights of right now.
We can't afford Labour. The country can't afford socialism. We cannot afford to wait. And I will not wait. It's time to seize the moment and turn this around.
Let's rebuild this party of ours, council by council, seat by seat, ward by ward, street by street, one party with one purpose.
Join me, work with me in this new Conservative Party, and together let's take a stand for the country that we love.
A Britain at ease with itself, a Britain that believes in itself. And that sort of Britain can only come about because of renewed Conservative principles.
So that was the order in which they did their speeches. And isn't it interesting, coming back to the story about the Chagos Islands and why some of them are sort of criticising James Cleverly for starting the negotiations that led to the islands being handed back to Mauritius is as a result of what happened in Birmingham this week, which is he sort of zoomed up the imaginary rankings.
No, I think he did. As we were saying on an earlier edition, it was his speech that stood out. It was his speech that I think he made the most of that moment. Now, whether that makes any difference is a kind of separate question. But next week we get some more voting, and we'll find out, within a week who those last 2 are, and then we will get to those debate points, because I think GB News have already said they're going to do a head-to-head debate. I suspect there'll be others in the second half of this month, in the way that there were with Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, and there were with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So I think we will get a bit of that, and perhaps a bit more sort of kind of blue on blue. But yes, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? If you're seen to rise up the rankings, then you've got a target on your back.
I'm now going to use a phrase, and I wish I'd actually Googled it before I said it, because it might mean something different. Cognitive dissonance.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So you had this razzmatazzy kind of presidential nominating convention that looked quite American, and there was videos and podiums and lights and stuff like that. But it is just, and I use the air quotes, to pick the leader of the opposition of a party that is very, very much smaller than it used to be in Parliament. So that's cognitive dissonance, number 1. Number 2, the people in the hall, the activists, they don't get to choose from those 4, because next week the MPs will whittle it down to 2. So that was a bit that's not really real. And also, you see all on TV and in your pieces that you were doing from there, all these activists and MPs who seem really quite jolly, even though they've just been completely clobbered by the electorate. So that was kind of cognitive dissonance point number 3.
Yeah, and I think they're all sort of fair points, really. I mean, and we also had the landmark moments during the Conservative conference where we entered the month before. We'll actually find out who's won.
Yeah.
Because we turned over into October, and it will be November before we find out who's won. And of course, we've been so used to Conservative leadership races involving Theresa May as a victor, and Boris Johnson as a victor, and Liz Truss as a victor, and Rishi Sunak as a victor, where they were becoming Prime Minister. So the stakes have been so much higher in the last 4 Conservative leadership races, and even arguably the last 5, because when David Cameron became Conservative leader, there was a reasonable chance that he would become Prime Minister, albeit 4 or 5 years later. And this time, there's one hell of a slog for an incoming leader of the opposition. I think there was a kind of awareness there of this kind of fairly inward conversation, because even if they were doing a bit of projecting to a wider audience, they would acknowledge privately that not many people are listening right now, because why would you at this stage? So yeah, I think all of those distances, and the sort of jolly thing, I mean, was the most striking thing of the conference overall. But then you get a load of political geeks together and they're chewing the cud, and there's another election underway.
Which they love.
Which people in politics love, and kind of away you go. And then throw in that the government, in their view, has sort of got off to a rough start, and there's certainly been some bumps in the road. One figure in government was saying to me today that we've had 5 weeks of the news grid all about freebies. They said, in that sense that this whole row about gifts they've just not been able to squash, as well as the winter fuel stuff and Sue Gray stuff and all the rest of it. So I think they think in this sort of survivor's elation thing that even though their parliamentary numbers are just dire, that maybe it's not ludicrous to think that they could be competitive at the next election.
It's so interesting because I actually didn't go to the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham, so I was one of the people who was watching it unfold from afar, although fair enough, I probably paid more attention than some might have, and I was on the old WhatsApp a lot to people who were there to try and get a sense of it all. But I think the point about the fact that they were very much talking to themselves in the room is what it did feel like when you're watching it from afar. But then you'd argue that that's kind of what they've got to do right now, because they are wrestling as a party with their direction and where they should go next. And they're making an internal decision about who's going to lead them. The sense of jolliness I found interesting, because at the same time that I was hearing from people there that it was all a bit more optimistic than you might have expected for a party that's just lost big at the election, I was also kind of getting a sense from some people that they were trying to rein it in a bit. And in fact, was it Jeremy Hunt who said this during his conference speech? Hang on, guys, there's still a mountain to climb. But sitting all behind that, I think you can draw a parallel with something we spoke about during the Labour conference, which is the sense that pervades politics now of a volatile electorate.
Totally.
I.e., things just aren't set in stone in the same way they were. You can win a colossal majority at one election. We saw it in 2019, colossal majority at one election. By the time the next election comes round, the other parties got winning big. And I think that was the pickup for me from both conferences. These are parties that are conscious. They constantly have an electorate that's willing to look, listen and change its mind.
I thought the most intriguing revelation from Birmingham, the Tory party conference, was that Robert Jenrick's daughter's middle name is Thatcher, in honour of the former Prime Minister, although he did actually then get the year in which she was elected leader of the Conservative Party wrong in his speech, but a little sidebar. But that's inspired us to ask you, newscasters, are you named after a politician or a famous person from history? Or in fact, have you done a Jenrick and named one of your children after a political figure? We've got some inspiration from the history books. There's, of course, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, shares a name with Keir Hardie, one of the founders of the Labour Party. Can you think of any others?
Nope.
Oh, there were William Jefferson Clinton.
There you go.
Is one, isn't it?
I've got another American presidential one for you. Milhouse from The Simpsons.
Bart Simpson's best friend.
Sometimes frenemy.
So fair enough.
Milhouse, that was Richard Nixon's middle name.
And that's why he's called Milhouse.
I was just saying, was that just a coincidence?
No, I think
That's
nothing
great
in The Simpsons
trivia.
is a coincidence.
Nothing, okay.
That's
Sorry.
great artwork.
Chris,
So,
come
I thought
on.
I'd just check.
It is written.
Someone's got to do a bit of scepticism around here.
And I discovered yesterday your middle name is Richard. That's not after Richard Nixon. Is it?
Not that I'm aware of. I'll check with my mum, but I don't think so.
Anyway, if you can do better than these two and come up with some other examples from your own life, then let us know. Newscast@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on 0330 123 9480. And that is all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.